Last week, we began our Lenten study on Soong-Chan Rah's book, Prophetic Lament, which walks us through the Book of Lamentations and the response of the people of Israel to the destruction and desolation of their beloved holy city. Rah notes that in the face of such deep suffering, the Israelites responded with two divergent postures. Some chose triumphalism, which manifested in either outright denial of the suffering or empowering up in order to overcome it. Others chose the posture of lament, an honest engagement of mourning, grief, and repentance. And that's what we have in the Book of Lamentations. In a time when we are disoriented and overwhelmed by a worldwide pandemic, political strife, and a racial reckoning, these same options are before us. Will we choose the posture of honest lament, or will we choose our own forms of triumphalism? In this second section of the book, Rah helpfully draws out the way in which privilege and exceptionalism make triumphalism the easier and more attractive option. Israel saw themselves as a privileged nation, and because of that, many thought they were exempt from God's righteous judgment. That's why in Lamentations 2, they are so appalled and humiliated that God had allowed Jerusalem to be sieged. This exceptionalism not only blinded Israel from seeing how far they had strayed from God's ways, but also allowed them to disregard and dismiss those God cared for, the marginalized and oppressed. Rather than move toward humility and empathy with those who had long known suffering, privilege and exceptionalism made the Israelites think that they were above such things. Rah points out the way that the dominant stream of American Christianity, tied to exceptionalism, has tempted the American church towards a similar path. Seeing itself as the new Israel, white American Christianity has often assumed a position of privilege and superiority over non-white churches. What's more, the American church has come to see protecting this position of privilege and the power inherent in it as essential to fulfilling its role as the new Israel. This is what we've seen play out in the past few years, as this stream of the church has mobilized itself to amass and protect political influence. This, in its extreme form, is what we saw played out in the attack on the Capitol. I especially appreciated Rah's insight that the privilege must be acknowledged but never assumed. Of course, if privilege is not acknowledged, it is easily abused. But it should also never be assumed. The privilege of God's presence, Rah notes, was a gift to the Israelites, a gift intended to make them more generous, a gift to be shared. The problem arises when we begin to assume that privilege is earned and therefore ours to keep. Lament is our God-given antidote to the corrupting influence of privilege and exceptionalism. In lament, the church can power down from the adrenaline of protecting privilege to the place of humility and repentance. In lament, those voices that privilege has silenced now have space to be heard. In lament, we can accept the reality of our suffering and the suffering that we have inflicted on others. And space is opened up for empathy, mutuality, and solidarity. I love the way Eugene Peterson's The Message paraphrases Paul's exhortation to the church in Philippi. Think of yourselves, Paul says, the way Christ thought of himself. He had an equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a servant, became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It took an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death. And the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion. Bishop Todd often reminds us that our call is to become the cooperative friends of Jesus for the sake of others. Lament creates a way for us to do this, even in the face of great suffering, even when we are convicted, even when we don't think we can take any more. Jesus did not use his privilege to deny or to overcome, but for the joy set before him, endured the suffering, endured the cross, scorning its shame. Lament allows us to lay down our privilege, to face into our suffering and the suffering of those around us, so that we might join Jesus on this holy journey toward loving God and loving others. This Lent, let's start on the path that Jesus has paved for us. And the first step is a posture of lament.